Batu, Barada, Nikto.
You must remember those words.
Gordon's alive.
You know what the Turing test is?
I know Kung Fu.
Dead or alive, you are coming with me.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Stories Out of Time and Space. I'm your regular host, Scott Weatherly, and as always, I'm joined by Julian Darius. Julian, how are you doing? You okay?
I am thoroughly traumatized.
That's
How
right.
about you?
Similar. I was kind of surprised. We are going to be talking about The Day After, a TV movie from 1983 which traumatized an awful lot of people, including, if legend be believed, Ronald Reagan.
Mm-hmm.
The story of a small Midwestern, is it Colorado? Midwestern?
Kansas?
Kansas, sorry, yeah,
Mostly,
small
Missouri
Kansas
and
town.
Kansas.
Yeah, small Kansas town outside of a nuclear missile silo base, and the lead up and the aftermath of a nuclear attack on America, and how it sort of affects people. Quite a heady cast. Jason Roberts, Joe Beth Williams, Steve Guttenberg in an early role, John Cullum, John Lithgow, Bibi Besh, and some real. I was watching this and going, "Oh my God, there's some names cropping up, some people I recognise." So this was a TV film. It runs for about 2.5 hours, or just over 2 hours, I should say. Sorry, and
Well, you haven't mentioned it was directed by Nicholas Meyer of Star Trek II fame.
Yes, that's a good point.
So,
Yeah,
you know,
quite
a pedigree.
He basically sort of like he was like this. I've done the Wrath of Khan. I'm now going to do the Wrath of Yeltsin. That's
That's
yeah.
right. The Wrath of Gorbachev.
Gorbachev. Yeah, it's interesting how I was the pedigree in this film, but there's something else I learned about this film. I was sort of just reading some little bits and notes. Although this is called The Day After, this was circulated before it was broadcast, which is I think where Reagan saw it, and it was presented and broadcast or projected at certain events, and it gave way to a movement that they called The Day Before, which was a movement that grew up to try and prevent anything from like this happening, which is kind of interesting. So it really did have an impact on American politics. This film was utilized in a way. It's fascinating.
Well, and it includes a note at the end that asks for exactly that. And that's worth mentioning because there are very few movies, very few comics, very few novels that have ever had a real impact on the world, right? You think of like Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. I mean, at least like JFK caused, some files to be opened and released. I mean, but I mean, there's really only a handful of movies that have ever had that kind of effect, and this is one of them.
Yeah, and I understand why. I'm not gonna lie. I mean, it's most definitely it's a film of two halves, and you have to appreciate that.
Well, it's a disaster movie structurally, right?
Yes,
it introduces the ensemble cast. It's just that the disaster is nuclear
war.
Armageddon. Like that's amazing.
Well, I was kind of I mean, I was thinking it's just over 2 hours long, and in my head as I was watching it and it started, I was like, I wonder how soon are they going to give you that nuclear event, and what's it going to be? Because again, I'd never seen this before. I'm coming to this sort of like decades later, and the one thing playing in my head, and we'll talk about is the Terminator 2. To me, Terminator 2, the nightmare that Sarah Connor has in Terminator 2, where I don't know if you remember it, I think it's in the main film, bulked up sort of like military Sarah Connor walks up to a fence and she looks over and the younger version of herself is there with young John, and then the nuclear cloud sort of like sprouts when you have the wave come out, and then they all turn to ash and get blown away, and the skeleton's there on the fence, and that terrified me in the early 90s. So I was like, oh, it's not going to stand up to that. Oof, it didn't need to. Like this film, like yeah,
You know, the thing that amazes me about this movie, and you know, we've talked about some movies this season that have had good ideas, but you know, been poorly executed.
mm,
You think about like, you know, we just talked about Day and His Dog recently,
yeah,
and you
A Boy and His
said it
Dog.
was flat. A Boy and
Oh
His Dog. So,
yeah,
and you know, that has more of a budget than this
yeah,
does. Like, you know, this has takes every shortcut imaginable associated
yeah.
with cheap budgets and cheap movies. You know, there are shots that are embarrassing, there are lines that are embarrassing, there's a lot of stock footage, you know, like characters look off and it's like, is this a 1915 movie? Like characters look off and you see like footage of a rocket launch,
It's
you know, and
grainy.
it's like,
It's clearly from the
yeah,
1960s news footage. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, this has every cheap, bad, sort of painful decision like that. And somehow it works. Somehow it is so affecting.
yeah,
It is just, you know, we have watched people being eaten. We have
yeah.
watched people, you know, being dismembered. We have watched
Well,
so many horrors over the course of these movies. And somehow this movie with no budget, reusing footage and doing cheap special effects is so powerfully affecting. And that is to me my biggest takeaway from this film.
one
I
of the
don't know
things,
how it does it.
the thing to me is it builds, and I think it's brutal in its not just its depiction of the event, but the aftermath. And I think there's some
Mhm.
stuff we will talk about. But I think the reason it works is we talked about when we talked about on the Patreon. I used a phrase, the cozy cataclysm, where it's sort of, yes, it's the end of the world, but everyone's still able to sort of have a cup of tea and a biscuit, and they're still sat around knitting and all that shit. You know what I mean? It's like it's the end of the world, but it generally still feels like, this was a term that was used for disaster sort of things of the 60s and 70s in British TV was, the cozy cataclysm or the cozy catastrophe. But this has got that same thing. It kind of sets you up to expect that. The first hour is all very like, home on the prairie almost. Like, obviously
Mhm.
modern depictions of that, but it's kind of like, down
They're worried
home
about
sort of
sports and,
just
you
yeah,
know, in
local
the
sort of thing.
background, this tension's escalating in Berlin.
Exactly. But it does it really well in that, like, as you say, it's a disaster movie. You've got pockets of people. You're introduced to. There's a generational family where the daughter is going to be marrying this other guy, and they're getting ready for the wedding, but she's still living at home. And then they go off to, there's these people in college, and one of them's coming home, and there's all these groups of people, and you're setting them up, and you're seeing just days in their life. Like it's kind of like cozy, it's comfy, like the everyday trials and tribulations that we all face. There's sort of um and when the first sort of 20 minutes is exactly that. Like it's very mundane. It's incredibly mundane, intentionally so. Like it's introducing these characters in sort of very sort of mundane, everyday ways. It's the students and all this other stuff. And as you say, the tension sort of ratchets up. Like it's literally like that. The minutes to midnight. All of a sudden, you hear it on the news footage, and everyone starts getting a little bit panicky and starts talking about it. The college students are asking questions. The college professors making comments, and then you'll see a news footage, and all of a sudden there's something else going on, and all of a sudden all the guys are, and then you got there's the black couple and the guy sort of who's a soldier, and he's called back to the base, and he's going,
And
I
of course,
think
he says, "Look, it's just we're running the checks twice, right?
exactly, it's just a trial,
Right."
don't worry. But but his wife's saying, but you're taking everything. He's like, well, I've got to. It's a drill. We've got to do it properly. And again, like they all get there, and it gets ratcheted up a little bit more. And
Mhm.
then all of a sudden, people are going to the supermarket and panic buying, and they're buying bunches of stuff. And you start to see
That's
how,
really an affecting scene.
oh, now Yeah,
I mean, of course, we've been through it with
yeah.
COVID, right? You know,
But
but
one of my favorite scenes in this that really, again, I think this goes to Nicholas Meyer and how he sort of shoots some of this to be simple but effective.
mhm,
One of the main characters is the college student, the blonde college student, who is kind of like the main for the first hour is the main character. He's going to be marrying this girl. He's this good-looking sort of like farm boy. He's all sort of like everyone loves him. They all go off to church every Sunday, and they're in a hairdresser's, and he's getting a haircut for his wedding.
mm,
That's what he's there for. So he's like, oh, tidy it up. And John Lithgow, who I love John Lithgow and everything he
I
does.
do too.
Yeah, he's
I
amazing.
don't know why. I
No,
don't
I don't
know
know why.
why. I just love
Amazing.
Lithgow. Yeah,
Yeah,
and
but
he
he's
doesn't get enough to do here. But
no, but
but he sits
amazing.
in the background of the.
The hairdressers, and they're saying like, and he said, well, it's just it's just a nothing. They have people that will deal with these things. And then he pipes up, and I think he's a professor in this, and he sort of says, "Well, yes, but," and then he starts saying, "But this has happened, and then that's happened," and then they said, "Well," and then he says, "But we're in the middle of nowhere," and there's a line that he says, "In a nuclear
Mm,
war, there's no such thing as the middle of nowhere," and it's kind of like you see in the reflection this kid's face where he's like, there's a true sort of dawning of the realization of like, oh shit, like this is what I'm seeing in the streets is legit. Like, people should have a right to be panicked. Um, and I just thought that was a really small but effective scene. The one thing it doesn't say, because he talks about populated areas, but the other thing they don't talk about is not only he mentions that they live next to a nuclear silo, which is one
mhm.
thing, but they're also farmland. So where else do you get what if you want to cripple a country, you irradiate, it's farmland. Um, so there's all that, and it just keeps this rat. That first hour is that ticking to it, and you don't realize it. And I love that about that first hour. I thought it was really well done. I don't know, sorry, I was going on, but I just thought it was really well done. Um,
No, I love everything you said, and there's this kind of like broadcast going on and special reports, and um, I love the way people react to that news. It's all very realistic. I love that ratcheting effect, right? And the audience, this is the kind of like the ticking clock that you talk about,
mm,
right? Like
mm,
the audience feels the tension that the characters don't,
yes.
right? Like the audience is like, pay attention, right? Um, and one of the effects of these mundane sequences is to uh first of all to humanize and characterize the people who are going to die terribly,
Yeah.
but also to present the futility of making plans, right?
Yes.
Like all of our plans, I'm gonna get a new, air cleaner for my apartment, like, right. We all know there are circumstances that might happen in which this is insane to be doing right now, and it's
Yeah.
totally out of your hand.
I'm getting new
Um,
air filters. Good for you. Air filters
yeah,
aren't going to do anything against
right.
radiation.
Yeah, or like, the getting married, the big game, all these kinds of things that we think matter.
Yeah.
And they matter, but they matter presuming a tsunami doesn't come and destroy where I live, or a nuclear apocalypse doesn't happen. And we all live under that kind of existential threat, right? We're all used to it. But um, I remember very much growing up in the 80s, and I'm a little older than you, and we did duck and cover drills.
Yeah.
And we really thought that the world was going to end. Um, and when I talked to my parents about it, they said this thing about the military bases, where they said, son, we live near an Air Force base. It will be a nuclear target, and we will die. And and I said, that's terrible. Shouldn't we move? And they said, no, you want to die.
Mm.
If it happens, you don't want to survive. Um, Understanding that, having to understand that as a 6-year-old kid, like that was something we lived through in the 80s. And I know
Yeah.
a lot of people talk about like the Cuban Missile Crisis and, the trauma of growing up in the 50s and 60s and stuff, but there was a different kind of trauma in the 80s. And I especially love that conversation between the doctor and his wife about the Cuban Missile Crisis and how they've seen life. And everybody will say this, right? Everybody says, we've heard this and it hasn't happened. I remember when COVID was happening and I met with one of my friends, and I knew it was the last time I was going to see him for some time. And I was following the CDC and I was like, oh, it's real. And, I mean, he's a lawyer. He's,
Mm.
an educated guy. And I was walking through a supermarket just staring at people thinking, why isn't there a run on the supermarket, right? Like, do these people not know what this is all going to look like in a week? And they didn't.
Mm.
And I met him and I said, let me tell you what I'm hearing, and he said, well, we went through SARS, we went through, one concern after another, and I'm like, let me tell you what's going to happen in the next
Yeah.
few months, and but it was just this way that our brains say, of course, I mean, he's super busy, he's trying cases,
Mm.
right? He doesn't have time to pay attention to this, and it's so easy to say, well, I've had a long life, I've been through a lot of scares, um, is this going to be the one, that takes us out? It's easy to kind of dismiss it based on experience, but some of the horror of nuclear war, right, or the horror of a real disaster is no, one disaster can destroy everything.
Well, there's a couple of characters, the minor characters in this that sort of fit that mold. I mean, we get main characters that do things, but within the university, when you meet the sort of young Steve Guttenberg, and I think that's where John Lithgow works, there's a couple of other students, and there's a young woman with wearing glasses, and she's very much of the opinion of like, well, why would they start this? Who would? Of course they went. This isn't going to happen. Like it'll get to that point, and then everyone will get around the table, and we're going to be okay. And that's her kind of opinion throughout. Like she's the one that's going, well, no, this is ridiculous. And then she has there's a friend of hers who's much more into the detail. And it's going like, well, who would fire first, and where would this be? And then it jumps to him. I don't want to get to the event yet or the attack yet, but when the missiles do fire, and it's really well done because it's sort of like all of a sudden these missiles are taking off, and you just see these streams of smoke. And she, in her response, as she sees this, is, "Oh, they must be da 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 these smaller missiles." And it's just John Lithgow. The look on John Lithgow's face, this professor who just says, "No, those are from the silos. They're going to
Yeah.
travel to nuclear targets, and they're going to get there in about half an hour." And he looks back, and the other person says, "So the others have launched." He says, "Probably." And you know then that they've got half an hour. That's it. Like if we've launched, they've launched. That's it. And it's sort of that realization of like, as you said, like it just takes this one event. Like you can get through 100 of these, and on the 101st, that's it. That's the one that wipes you out. And you can feel the weight of that throughout as this thing sort of cranks up. And I just think that's it's really, really well done in that set. And as you say, it jumps to these different bits and pieces where um it'll have like people at home and they're doing things, or they run on the sort of the supermarket eventually, and then it'll cut to an army base, but you never see enough of an army base or an army scenario to really get what's going on. You just get like snippets of information, and it feels more and more tense in the army base. The thing that this doesn't do, which I appreciate and glad it doesn't, you never see Washington. There's
Hmm.
never a scene of like, and here's the president on the big red telephone or anything like that. Like it's, that's not information that people are going to get. And I love the fact that there's a big part of this is people having that discussion that when it is going to happen. It's like there's a news broadcast, and I think it says a nuclear device has been set it off in a
Airburst over enemy
Europe.
troops. Yeah.
Yeah. And they're like,
Yeah.
who's done that? What's gone on? Well, how's it happened? Da da da. And it's the confusion, it's the lack of information. And so the fact is we're not getting information. So if you were in the Oval Office or something, you'd have to be giving that information.
Hmm.
And the fact is, okay, we are too distant from that. We don't need that information. We're never going to have that information. So we're not going to give the audience that information either. So there's constantly that sense of when's it coming? We can feel it like cranking up. When's it coming? And I think I really appreciate how well it does that um, constantly.
Yeah, I mean, this is the man on the ground's point of view.
Yeah.
This is not about the drama in Washington. It's not about the soldiers. It's about, it's no coincidence that this is set largely in Kansas,
Uh-huh.
right? I mean, this is Superman's home,
Oh,
right?
yes.
This is the salt of the earth, the predominantly white, middle
Small town
class,
America. Yeah.
right? Um, and that's an excellent choice,
Mm.
it really drives home this plot. And I was thinking as you were talking, like, for as much as I'll defend him for what he does do, well, imagine how horrible this would be directed by Michael Bay, right? It would all be, dramatic picking up the red phone and, tons of soldiers deploying shot like pornography. And,
Mm.
it's the restraint of this film in
Yeah.
not doing that, in focusing on common people that makes this work. And that denialism that you talk about with the missiles, like if you've ever been in situations like a car crash, right? Or you've been to an accident or something, and you see people just denying reality in front of them.
Yeah.
Um, you see some of this. And it's just amazing how, again, like on such a low budget, whether it's Meyer, um, or whatever. I mean, this film touches those emotional chords, and it doesn't largely do it through, like, there's no soliloquy,
Uh-uh.
there's no, like, like, this is your actor moment, it's gonna win you an Emmy, like, there's no, this is such an unshowy movie, but it knows how to drive home those psychological moments, those emotional moments with pinpoint accuracy.
Well, I think the main center of this family, there's two main centers for this film. One is Jason Robards as Dr. Oakes, who's sort of the head of this family, and he works at this hospital. And then the other one is the family that um, Steve Guttenberg ends up staying with. And
Mhm.
but at the beginning, they sort of perform these two sort of tandem areas. They know each other. Like, this is all part of small. One of them lives in Kansas City, but his hospital is just outside this small town, and so on and so forth. And then there's this black couple, and you follow the main soldier. So it's giving you all that information, and like you said, there are little moments throughout. None of it's like Oscar. Like you say, this isn't sort of your sort of, like you say, this is your monologue. Give your, this is your Oscar moment. There's just lots of little moments, and some of those little moments are so good. Like, um, little conversations. Or one of my favorite ones is towards the end when they're like, something's coming. The farmer who sort of, it's his house. His wife's making the bed,
Mm.
and she's just sort of straightening the sheets, and she keeps faffing with the sheets, and he says, we've got to go, we've got to go, and he just grabs her, and she just wails and turns into like to hysterics. And as you say, it's that sort of like the denialism has been there for all this time, and all of a sudden it's like, look, there is no denying this anymore. We've got to go down into the shelter. um and it's sort of like, those little moments, as you say, sort of, constant little moments, um is just so well done. There's just touches even going, oh God, this, as the viewer, like, it's about to get bad. And then, but you see that they sort of know it more and more by the time. Um, let's let's talk about the event then. The hour mark. It comes at the hour mark. It comes at like 1 hour, two
Yeah.
minutes. Very well done.
You imagine watching this on TV, right? Like, this is the most watched
Yeah.
TV movie in history. Okay.
But it's not like, again, there's no like hold your breath moment.
Hmm.
You talk about the Michael Bay sort of approach. There'd be a the button has been pressed. Like, there'd be a
Hmm.
gasp. There'd be the hold your breath moment around the sort of the war room or whatever, where everyone will stand still. There is not that. That you see, you hear this thing that's happened, and all of a sudden, then soon after, you just see this thing where it goes to a military base. There's some activity, and all of a sudden, bang! The American missiles are being launched.
Well, you do see the keys being turned,
What's I'm saying?
you
You
know,
see, yeah,
which
but
is brilliant. I mean, I love. There's something so effective about opening the hatches and taking the tape off, and
yeah,
soldiers following orders and commands. And of course, you think this is madness, right?
yeah,
Like, look at how orderly we are about Armageddon,
destruction,
right?
yeah.
Like,
But it's not like, but from the
yeah.
families, from the sort of you said the everyday folk, there's no hold your breath moment. Like they don't know this is
Mhm.
coming. It's only like they're all doing their usual thing. Like they're up on the roof having a cigarette. They're mowing the lawn. They're riding their bike. They're doing whatever. And all of a sudden you see those plumes of smoke going up, and the missiles are going, and everybody's like, "Oh, like Christ, what's going on?" And then there's a little bit of stuff, but then it turns, and you get the Dr. Oakes is driving his car to get back to Kansas City, and all the cars are trying to get out, and all of a sudden, boom, you just get this. First off, you get a flash overhead, and it emits the electromagnetic pulse that we all now know, and everything dies. Like cars die, hospital equipment dies, TVs die, everything.
And that EMP effect was relatively new,
Yeah,
in the 80s, right? I mean, like this was a relatively new idea.
yeah.
And it was like a year later where it's in Dark Knight Returns, you know, but which was when I was first exposed to it.
Mm.
But, you know, this was new stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then you get the mushroom clouds.
Yes. Yeah. And it just goes to like about a 4 minute sequence of just things being vaporized, like buildings being leveled. And you see, it clocks into like stock footage. It does use it, but it's very, very effective. And this is very low budget. It doesn't have the special effects to do much, but it has this way of utilizing color and light along with the silhouettes of skeletons. Like
Mm.
people are sort of like silhouetted as a skeleton, and then it's just boom, and it's all the people you've been following. Like you don't know who's going to get it, and there's others you're just never going to see again. Like you don't see them eradicated, but you're just never going to see them again. Um, it's a gut punch of a moment.
Yeah, it's pretty effective, and it's surprisingly effective. And I think that it's more effective because the movie's been so muted. There has been this ratcheting up, but I mean, even the missiles rising into the air. I mean, you can see that they're drawn on. Like every second, there's an
Yeah,
additional little bit drawn on.
yeah,
Um, you know, and it's been very muted. And then you have this sort of like torrent of destruction, and you see people sort of running and being destroyed, and families, and one thing after another. And I don't know how it manages to be so effective.
yeah,
It's just that sort of movie magic of what works and what doesn't. And what works is not the CGI. What works is not, it has nothing to do with budget. It has to do with editing. It has to do with just, capturing that combination of audio and visual that kind of hits you right in your soul. And this movie does it, and I don't know how it does it.
yeah.
Even in that destruction sequence, it's like what you're seeing is very limited, but boy, is it effective.
And I think that's you say it's not like a special effect spectacular, which we can expect today in modern film. They'd show all the bits and pieces, and they could show all kinds of like gory, incredible things. But it's just the knowledge of it. Like it gives you, it's this thing of just saying, like, yeah, this, we can't afford this, but this is what you're gonna experience. Like this is what's gonna happen. And it gives you that insight. Like you say, it's just very effective. And I think because it's set up those people incredibly well, it kind of it's kind of like, oh Christ, like, like any good disaster film, you don't know who's gonna cop it. And the one for me is I've assumed that the blonde lad who was in the hairdressers is gonna
Mhm.
be is remaining a main character, and he's riding on his bike, and his bike packs up, and you're like, oh no, like get to cover, like get to cover. Nope, doesn't make it. Boom, off he goes, and it does it with several others as well.
Mhm.
And so you're sort of left in a place where the holding your breath moment, instead of coming before it, comes after it, because after it you are sort of stuck there going like, okay, well what does come on the day after? Like who's left? Um, and I can imagine if this was, on American TV, like there were adverts in this. Like if you were sort of watching this and an advert came just after the devastation of this, I'd have been
Oh yeah.
fuming.
Well, this is one problem with the advertising model is, every once in a while you have something brilliant,
Uh,
and you think, like, for example, Cops, has been accused of being racist and promoting the police and police brutality and all of this, and ideas of black people and minorities as
mm,
criminals. And the makers of Cops, it's off the air now, but always said, yeah, we're liberals, we're totally aware of this, we're doing something that we are bothered by. uh why don't you show people who aren't criminals? Why don't you show us? And they say, well, cannot figure out how to sell Colgate toothpaste while doing it.
yes.
you know and we say part of why this works is that it eschews all of those Hollywood cliches of the heroes, and it's all
Yeah.
going to end well. You just have to try and feel deeply enough, and for it to really work out. And you want the hero, the happy ending, and all of that. The heroes all die here.
Yeah.
And you can see this being a hard sell at network for who the hell wants to advertise Colgate after to
So we've got
people
the
who've just watched the
that's it.
atomic
So
devastation.
we've got the 1 hour 10 advertising. We've got 3 minutes at 1 hour 10. Who wants a 30-second slot?
Well, we did Twilight Zone. This is a huge part of what he talked about,
Yeah.
of like, how do I, the advertisers have to be able to sell their product.
Yeah.
And, you know, yeah, I mean, it's a problem.
It's
But
it's
no, I mean,
fascinating.
it's
Yeah.
hard to imagine those commercials going on. Like,
I almost want to watch
imagine an
this. I
ad for like,
almost
take a vacation to
yeah.
Disneyland. I mean, it's like, that doesn't matter anymore.
Yeah.
The world's all gonna end.
Now I've seen it as a full film. I'd love to try and actually see a part of this with advertisements in, just to see like who lost their job a week later when this was broadcast, and someone comes in and is like, you did what? You bought what advertising space? Oh Christ. Yeah.
Come on down to Pottery Barn. Like I just saw the looting scene.
Yeah.
Like,
Yes, Olive Garden straight after the shopping sort of spree. Yeah, all
well,
these
your
things.
family here.
Yeah. So it's fascinating, but it does go into the day after. And again, we get like 3 or 4 different tracks. Like, and this is again, it focuses in. I feel the second half is a lot more focused.
Mhm.
It gives you really only like maybe like two, I think it's 2 or 3 sort of very specific stories that are going on. There's the Dr. Oakes in the hospital,
Mhm.
and then the family that Steve Guttenberg is with. Those are the main two, and you sort of get like a wider community sort of story of what's going on. But again, this thing at the hospital where like people just start turning up and they've got like, or the other one, sorry, is the African American, the black
Black
soldier,
Soldier, yeah.
and
Who has
he's
left? There's this great conversation as he's leaving the base beforehand, where it's like, "Are you going to shoot me? Like we need to go down there." As military, this is the one thing you wouldn't see in a Michael Bay movie, right? Is the military discipline breaking down, right?
I mean, he
Which is
makes a
not supposed to happen, but
no, but he makes a good point because he sort of says, "Well, what do we do now?" And everyone's like, "We stay here and continue to guard." He's like, "Guard what? Holes in the ground? Like the missiles have gone." So yeah, and they do like he ends up leaving.
Hmm.
He goes AWOL
I
to
mean,
get to his wife.
right.
And he becomes the sort of, and this is why I like this, the way that this sets up these three
Hmm.
is the hospital shows sort of like there's an element of humanity, but it shows you starts to show you like the medical side of all this other stuff, like what's going on, what they've got to deal with, the trauma of being a frontline medic in this situation. With the family, you get this sort of thing of being trapped in a basement, like a shelter. They've got a nuclear shelter, and uh the consequence of that, like there's some psychological breakdown and all kinds of stuff there. And then those start to interweave. And then the soldier he's the sort of crossing the country, like he's trying to make his way
Hmm.
to his wife, and he meets all these different people along the way. And a lot so it provides you with those different chunks of information to give you a full picture of what's going on. And continues to be incredibly well done.
And incredibly brutal,
Yeah.
right?
Oh yeah.
Without special effects, without, watching people's faces melt. I mean, this is practical effects. They're putting makeup on people, but you're seeing like these terrible radiation burns. People's, I mean, their hair falling out, their
Radiation
skin.
sickness. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just, you know, uh, really just appalling. You're looking at people and just thinking, not only are you going to die, but this is going to be terrible.
Yeah. Well, the hospital in particular, like, you have these two doctors. The other one is I need to find his name. Um, I can't find him in the cast. It's kind of annoying. But you have the other one that's really interesting is because you have like Dr. Oaks, but he has a Japanese doctor that he works with.
Hmm.
Um, and um, I can't find him in here, but basically, there's one of the boy from the young boy from the family that with the shelter when the bombs went off. The flash goes and they say like, "Don't look at the flash," and of course he already
Mm.
has. So he's had like flash burns on his eyes and he's sort of all wrapped up. He's been blinded by it. But they had this conversation later on. He says, "Oh, you're Italian." And he's like, "Yeah, right, I'm Italian." Like they have a bit of a joke between themselves. But he has this. There's a thing about I forget what the boy says later on about this has never happened before. Has this ever happened before or something? And you can sort of see that obviously this Japanese doctor sort of doesn't want to go. Yeah, well, you kind of flattened my you know ancestral home. There's definitely that
Mm.
sort of there's that kind of weight to some of the things that are going on as well. That like um, not only we know no, this isn't the case if we didn't know what would happen. Like we've seen this happen. Like we have to recognize the devastation.
We all knew.
Yeah,
Yeah, and I mean that we all knew that anger, you're supposed to be angry,
yeah,
you know. Uh you're supposed to see the madness of this, right? Um, and not to this is obviously a lot worse than COVID, but I mean, so much of my anger during lockdown was you all knew this was coming. Like none of this is surprising. I've been prepared for this my whole life. We all
yeah,
knew we were late for this. What are you doing denying it? What are you doing going to, concerts?
yeah,
like you people are fucking crazy. But I mean, that sense of we all knew we didn't put we were busy getting married and doing all these things. We didn't put pressure on our Congress people to stop this. Obviously that's the advocacy part of this, but it's
yeah,
very subtle in the film. It's
yes,
not, you know, it lets the depiction, speak for itself. And it really is just a kind of a litany of horrors.
mm,
You mentioned the kid who's got his eyes burned, and as they take him to the doctor, to that same Asian doctor, he is sort of being it's like a horse and buggy,
yeah,
and he can't see, and he says, what's going on? And they say, oh,
usual,
usual cows, nothing remarkable. And of course, you already know those cows are all dead in the field. And the camera pulls back, And here one of the many times that you do get a wide shot that is really effective. And you see not only are there tons of cows dead, but they're throwing bodies to the side, right? I mean, he's feet away from just, a score of bodies. And again and again, just these horrors, but these very understated horrors.
Yeah. Well, it's that thing of, like you say, that scene, there's the bodies and the cows, but there's also like the soldiers are back out and they're just putting the bodies on the back of a truck, aren't they? And it's just sort of loading them up to be taken away. Um, yeah,
And the
that's what I'm saying.
hospital has to decide, right before the doctor collapses, they're talking to him about we have to do mass graves,
Yeah,
Um, the morgue's been full, and of course we've gone through this too.
hmm
I mean,
And you see the mass graves. I think one of the things that's interesting is um, Steve Guttenberg's character, called Stephen, which is weird, but he takes the young boy. He sort of says, "Look, he's saved by this family taken into their shelter," and the daughter. This is the family daughter that was going to marry the other guy, and she has like this emotional breakdown where she's like, "No, I've got to get out of here. I've got to get to him. I was going to get married." And you say about this idea of the fragility of what we consider to be the mundane. Um, she's obsessed with like, well, I was going to wear this dress, and I was going to get married, and I was going to have this, and that's the thing. And she breaks out of uh
basement.
the basement and runs across the farmland and stuff. And it's like you say, it's just like there's two dead cows. There's the way the land is just arid, like it's just gone. It's just everything's the crops are all gone and everything. And she sort of, she's gone like stir crazy. She's hysterical, and he takes her down, like holds her down and brings her back to the basement. But then she's, this thing is like she can't stay there anymore. She gets like it's like cabin fever or thing. But there's psychological breakdown, the psychological realization of like this has happened. Like there's a new status quo now, and it's not a good one. So she goes into like a catatonic state, you find. But then she gets taken to the hospital, and again, everyone gets sort of separated, and Steve ends up helping because what you got to do, you got to, help, and he's there digging the graves and putting the bodies in. And I thought this is interesting because this is pre, the next year Steve Guttenberg would become a star. Like 1984's Police
Mm.
Academy is what really put him on the map. But as an actor, like he doesn't do himself, and he's good in this. Like he's
No,
not, but like he doesn't hold it. There's no ego in this film. Like he starts to sort of suffer from radiation sickness. He loses his hair. He has bruising on his face, and it sort of as it propels through the film. And it's just fascinating to see how every character starts to suffer from. They really do play it down. Like Russell, like the Dr. Oakes, is getting more and more frail. His hair is getting thinner and thinner. He's looking grayer and grayer. Like it's just it's the sort of a slow build horror film of everything that's going on. Like they just keep trying to live and to push. But they just the why. Well, I don't want to get right to the end, but there's just several scenes. But like you say, they've talked about mass graves, they've talked about these different bits and pieces. Um, but the wider story is they go out to the farmland and you see this the farmers are um all sat about and they've been brought together and
mm.
they have instructions from the government that says, oh, we've got to get back, anything that we've
It's
got
a
to get back
great
to,
scene, right?
we've got to, yeah,
Here's
we've got to
what to
get,
do.
here's what to do. We've got to get rid of, scrape away your topsoil, the top, however, it says scrape away the topsoil, focus on building human feed crops, nothing for animal feed, just human feed crops. Here's the things that are most resilient, da da da. And all of a sudden the questions come, and they're like, okay, cool. How much topsoil do I need to get rid of to be effective? Like, how do I know it's not irradiated? Well, the first 3 or 4 inches, and the guy's like, cool, 150 acres
Hmm.
of 3 or 4 inches up. Where's that gonna go?
Right. Yeah, and it's just going to blow back. This is not going to work. And
Yeah,
what's the quality of the topsoil underneath that
yeah,
topsoil?
yeah,
Like um, these farmers have very practical questions about this,
Yeah.
and you just see, it's
No
not
one
that
has an answer.
nobody's in charge, but somebody's in charge. But the other thing is that you see not everybody's going to follow this.
Yeah.
They're dubious. They think this sounds like a government pamphlet. All along, you've seen this kind of like suspicion about, these government reports about the looming nuclear war.
Mm.
And, it reminds me, as we're in this kind of like post-fact landscape now with
Oh
social
yeah.
media and Trump. First of all, it's always been that way, that people have always doubted reality, but it would be so much worse now, you know? Like there'd be, InfoWars would be broadcasting, that topsoil's fine. In fact, it cures you. You need to
Eat
ingest
soil.
it,
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, I mean, but people are dumb, and people,
Mm.
you cannot corral people and get them, especially Westerners, to follow this
Yeah.
advice. And you just see this is going to be a disaster.
Well, yeah, and but I like like you said, you say it's such a fantastic scene because it does, but it's the fact that like the questions are quite simply practical. When it's like, well, where do I put this? Who's going to dig a hole for it? Like you said, it's going to blow back. What happens with this? Like, it's clear that like the government instruction could even say, they even call out and say this sounds like government nonsense, hasn't been thought through. That they haven't taken information or guidance from the right people. Um, and so it's a very small scene. It's quite a self-contained scene, and it's just sort of yeah, it's very, very effective. The other one that I find interesting is the church, which is kind of what
Yeah.
results in Stephen taking the brother and sister to the hospital. But you have people again like in a decimated church, a cross hanging, like partial burnt cross hanging from sort of
Mhm.
string, and this sort of this priest or this pastor sort of giving this sermon. But it's kind of like even he's like looking about with tears in his eyes, going like, "What am I saying?"
Yeah, and he's suffering badly
Mm,
from radiation
yeah.
poisoning. And clearly his flock is too. I mean, they're basically exposed to the elements in this
Mm,
devastated church. And he praises God and thanks God and um and thanks God for destroying the people who have destroyed the earth. And it's not long after that that you hear the president on the radio.
yes,
So
yes.
the rich people and the
Survived
politicians are fine, right? This is all bullshit that
that,
he's saying.
and that
And
speech is,
pedestrian,
but it's pitch perfect
yes.
for
Yes.
that very reason because it says like I, like you, have felt a personal loss in this moment of national tragedy. And it's all that. And it's all very, like you say, very pat, very sort of, you know,
Government speak.
government speak. And you see people crowding around listening to it. But like, it sort of pans out again and you see the chaos of what's going on. And you're like, yeah, like you said, the rich are in bunkers. He's fine. The government's fine. It's these people trying to scrape 3 inches of topsoil off their land that's going to be the real problem.
Well, and I think that the church scene, for me, as an American, I mean, these characters represent the sort of like salt of the earth,
Yeah.
the real America, quote unquote, a phrase I hate, but I mean, this is that kind of Americana
Mm,
romanticized thing. And part of it is the church. Part of it
mm,
is, those are Christian people. And the religion offers no comfort,
yeah.
and I can't help but think that part of the response to this movie, from some Americans, who are predominantly Christian, is not only to see the horror, but to see the horror of sort of how can I profess and call myself Christian when I see, because I don't believe, but if somebody does, and I sort of know the American mentality, that American mentality sees that religious scene and says, belief in God is going to be destroyed by this event.
Mm,
In some ways, that is even more horrifying than the physical destruction and all of the death, right? That not just that you have a responsibility as a Christian, but I think on a more palpable level for, an American audience to just think nobody's going to believe after this, right?
Yeah,
I mean, if a
yeah.
society does survive, it's not just our way of life that's destroyed, but our entire faith has been, rendered moot.
I don't think that would be the case though. I think we'd end up with we've ended up in this position because we sinned too much.
Hmm. Sadly,
You'd end up with
right.
the ultra
The
evan
Falwell
yeah, the ultra
explanation for,
exactly. The ultra
hurricanes.
evangelical kind of, outcome. Um,
Well, it was those rainbow flags that attracted those bombs, right?
that was it.
It wasn't those politicians. I don't know if you know this, but God hates rainbow flags and
Yeah.
he will send nukes to eradicate them,
Well, apparently
to
Putin
teach
has
people.
had
Because God is so loving.
That's it. Well,
That's what you do.
Putin has had gaydar installed on all the end of all nuclear weapons, apparently. So that's exactly what it's about.
You know.
It's ridiculous, but yes, that's what I think we're going. Um, there was two other things I wanted to sort of to draw attention to, which we discuss um as we come to the end
Can
of
I
this. So
can I
yeah,
back up? I just want to point out, when the daughter goes crazy and she goes upstairs, there's a whole thing with the dog they haven't let downstairs. And you see the
yeah,
dog's body and her, wedding dress lying there. And there's a lot that just kind of like brings that emotion home, that devastated landscape outside. Um, the other thing is you mentioned, the family that travels, and takes the daughter, to the hospital. Um, you never see what happens to the dog, but she's sick, she's been outside, she's in need of medical care. Uh, you do see, you see that person who's throwing bodies into the pit. One of them is in the same blanket, right, that she
hmm
was wrapped in, right? Um, and so the implication is, she's died.
yes,
They're not bringing her back. And they say to the boy who's blind, which is a nice metaphor, right? We're all going back, right?
mm.
And lie to him. And again, like this is all actually really subtly done, right?
Yeah.
But boy, that feels like a gut punch,
Oh,
like we're all gonna die,
yeah.
but like, yeah, your sister's already dead.
Well, there's the scene when Steve does go into that basketball, the sort of the hall,
Mm,
the gym hall, and he's making his way through all those people. And again, wide shot, like it pulls out, and that's a full hall full of extras, like people lying on each other, lying on cot beds, and all looking forlorn and all kinds of bits and pieces. He finds I don't know if I was never sure if it was the sister or not, but he finds that cot bed with a woman sort of lying in it. He obviously recognized from somewhere. And they have this conversation, and she's very ill, like her hair's all falling out. She's looking very pallid, and I mean the makeup effects in this are very good. I've got to say, like for what the money they had. And he says, "You're looking," and Stephen says, "Oh, you're looking great," and she sort of laughs it off a little bit. And he says, like sort of like speak for yourself. And he takes his hat off. He's wearing a baseball cap. And he takes the cap off, and you can see like just these strands of hair that are left, like in bits and pieces. And again,
yeah,
you're
he's
like,
wearing the cap because he's bald, basically.
yeah, basically, yeah,
And she says, "I'm losing my hair, my beauty's gone, and he's like, "Yeah, I'm so much worse."
yeah. And but again, you're like, and then it sort of pans across. There's all these just sort of like forlorn people in different, stages of radiation sickness, looking very ill. And that scene really bothered me. Like just that hall full of people was very, very effective. But
You know what it is? It's the Gone with the Wind scene, right? With the soldiers, where the camera just pans out and pans
mm,
out, pans out, and this is a very effective technique for mass casualty
yes,
events,
yeah,
right? It was actually used in the 1989 Invasion comic, DC, where you see all the superheroes,
yeah,
in medical beds.
yeah,
What gets me about that scene is him hobbling, looking for her.
yeah.
And you think, how do you search for somebody, right? Like it's just this mass of people. I mean,
Mm.
just looking for your
No
loved
records,
one.
no
Yeah.
organization, no, Um, but I want to talk about the Black Soldier, because I think
Mm.
his story is really cool. So he runs from the base, and then we return to him, and he's sort of wrapped in a blanket, and he starts meeting people on the road, and he's asking like, what about this place? What about that place? And they're all like, it's gone. Like these places are gone, and there's no sort of discussion. Like these are people that they've beaten, they are broken, and there's kids there and this other stuff. And this group is sort of we'll come back to what this group eventually does, but just this moment of like there's one guy that he gets to a point where there's like a water pump, and there's one guy that's trying to get to water and keeps getting pushed away and beaten up and stuff, and he intercedes and gets water and helps this guy. And to him, it's like one small, if I can do one act of kindness, one good thing, I can, not redeem myself. It's not about redemption, but it's like I can hold on to something that shows that we're still, good or normal or whatever. And he gets to like a registration point, or I don't know what it is, for the hospital maybe, I think. And there's a guy
Yeah.
at a table, and he's like, "I'm so and so, da, 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 I've got this and this, I've got this bruising, and this is the person he's picked up." And the guy at the desk is just so sort of like dismissive. And he eventually says,
Zones
"Look,
out.
yeah, I just zoned out." It's just sort of like he's just filling the paperwork again and again at the same. And the soldier says, "I know we've got radiation sickness, but is there anything we can do? Is there anywhere we can go?" And then again, it sort of looks up and you just see all these people in like lines and stuff, and he's like, "No." He doesn't say anything. He's just like, it clearly looks at them like, are you daft? What do you think, we're supposed to do? It's just that sense of just being overwhelmed with, this sense of like misery and just sort of hopelessness. Like, the soldier tried to do something to gain a little bit of hope, but ends up entering a situation that is just endlessly hopeless. And again, that was like, geez, like this film's so so kind of downbeat. Like,
Hmm.
but I'm so impressed with how it keeps. It doesn't want to repeat itself, and it could easily do so, but it keeps hitting you with these sort of moments, and you're just sort of like, oh yeah, no, that's bloody hell, that's not good either.
Well, you talk about hopelessness. I think of powerlessness.
Yes,
You know, I mean, and I think of like the most frustrating thing is when there's nothing you can do,
yeah,
right? I mean, if you have a loved one who's sick and you think I can take them to the hospital, right? Like, okay, I've done my thing. Like, but it's in those moments when somebody isn't consolable and you say everything you can and you can't make any difference
mm,
to this person who's suffering. That's when the heartbreak really starts.
mm.
Um, in the sense, like, it's hope, but it's also what he can do to have some kind of power over his circumstances to help this guy.
Yeah,
Um, and we all want to believe that we have some kind of, I mean, this power, this gets at the American dream, right? The myth of, you can build your life and be prosperous and talk about, well, the death of that. What does it
mm.
mean if you have no power over whether you and your family survive? Um, there is a way in which that powerlessness that's dramatized strikes at, you know, the heart of those ideals that make America mean anything.
I think that's yeah. I think this comes to the end of the film actually as well. The that idea, because the end of the film is that the doctor, Dr. Oakes, he's been very sick, he's collapsed, and he sort of knows that his time is done. And I'll tell you what, I mean, again, I want to applaud the makeup on this film, that they do a really good job of making people look deathly ill. Um, but he basically says, I can't do here. I want to go home to Kansas City. Like I want to go see my home in Kansas City because he knows his wife and stuff was there. Um, and so he joins the like a group of soldiers. Jumps into he gets into the back with a bunch of soldiers and they're driving off. And the end of the film, this is going back to this idea of the American dream, this idea of building up a homestead and defending your home and all this other stuff. is he sort of like stumbles and staggers through the wreckage. And again, they've kept it close quarters relatively, but it looks like a crater. There's a fireplace there and something, and he sees possessions that were once his. So there's a watch and a brooch and some of the bits and pieces. And he looks over and there's a family sort of under like a tarpaulin shelter, clearly just as ill as he is.
Mhm.
And he just looks at him and says, "Get out my house." And they look at him really confused, like, "What? What are you on about?" But there's a genuine sort of like, fear, like sense, or for him, a sense of I don't know, personal invasion. Like this was his space. Um,
Well,
this
it
was his
seems to me that
home.
it's about that powerlessness, right? I
Yes.
mean, it's like he's come there to die.
Yeah.
I mean, he knows he's dying. There's a great scene where, he wakes up he collapses being in charge of the hospital, and suddenly he's a patient, and he wakes up
Mm.
and realizes, he says, "Oh, I'm dying." Um, and so he's come there to die, and it's sort of like they're invading the sacred space to him.
Yes.
Um, and it's like, all, as absurd as it is in this rubble, all I can do is protect my home,
Yes.
protect the wreckage of, and of course it's stupid, right? I mean, it makes no sense. The home's gone. You're protecting a pile of rubble. And there's probably the corpses of your family buried underneath that rubble, right?
Yeah. I mean, the
But he
scenes
doesn't have the strength to do it.
no, I have to say the scenes of him going through the rubble that they have done. There's some sort of superimposing of images on it, but they've done a really pretty effective view of a decimated city. And you say about um, you know, this is a dark film. This is a hard hitting film. I mean, this film does not mess around with these images. But so it's showing you like a decimated city. You're showing the rubble. There's clearly bodies and stuff in that rubble. And you have this moment where he's like defending his home, as you said, that powerlessness. But it ends with him sort of falling to his knees, and this other person sort of just like lurches over to him, and it ends with them holding each other.
Mhm.
And it's this again, this weird sort of, it's not a hope, like it's not a hug of, we're going to get through this. It's an acknowledgement of how hopeless and powerless the situation is. And
Mhm.
that kind of like that's kind of where it ends. And as you say, I've got I was looking for it, the dialogue here that it says at the end of the film. It says, "It is hoped that the images of this film will inspire the nations of this earth, their peoples and leaders, to find the means to avert the fateful day." And you think like, yeah, okay. I've spent 2 hours, just over 2 hours watching this, and I was, kind of I don't know. It leaves you not only kind of cold. It left me cold is probably the best way to describe it. Like, it left me that sense of um we've taken, I think, some of this stuff for granted. You know, we had a period of the Cold War that culminated in the 80s, which I think felt more prescient because the USSR was sort of like was clearly on the decline. Um, but I think the media, the pop culture was picking up on it more than ever. But I think even now we sort of dismiss it. I feel a bit like there's that sense of being that student with the glasses that's like, well, why would we let that happen? It's a deterrent.
Mhm.
It won't happen. But it just takes, you know, there are certain countries that are desperately trying to become nuclear powers, Iran, North Korea, you know, Putin's got plenty of things if, just and he's
Well,
expansive powers. Who's to say that this isn't still a very
oh, it is.
real
It is.
fateful
I mean,
day.
Obama said what kept him up at night was India and Pakistan. You
Yeah,
know, a nuclear exchange there. And, all the research that I've done suggests that it really only takes, like something like 1 to 3 nukes to trigger a nuclear winter that affects the entire planet. Um,
Of the
we
yield
like,
that we have now. Like, yeah.
right. We like to think that, well, that's a survivable event, for the planet if there's a nuclear exchange between India and Pakistan. That's not necessarily the case. Um, yeah, I mean, and I think that, as somebody who grew up with this threat, and is concerned about like the Fermi paradox and whether
Mm,
nuclear war is, one of those thresholds. Uh, this is something I remain very worried about.
mm,
And I think that any scenario, human brains are not good at predicting unlikely events.
hmm
If you say
We
there's a
like
1%
patterns.
chance that,
Yeah.
something's going to happen, we say, well, I'm not going to worry about that. But, there's a 1% chance that like a hurricane is going to wipe out your city, right? Maybe build the dams and, because it's going to happen
Yeah.
eventually,
Or
right?
if you
You've
or if you
got
are,
to prepare for this.
if you're Batman and there's a 1% chance that Superman is going to take you out, you take out Superman and you get,
Well, I mean, we don't need to go all Dick Cheney, 1% chance of terrorism
yeah, I
means
know that.
kill all
Yeah,
the
yeah.
terrorists ahead of time. But I mean, humans are very good are very bad at predicting and dealing with unlikely events and large scale consequences. We evolved in small scale tribal units. Our brains aren't good at thinking globally, but we're also really bad at predicting unlikely things.
Yeah.
And I think that, you see this in like the markets where it's like, you know, yeah, it's unlikely that this company that's done well for 50 years is actually, gonna tank, but you think the odds of that are, close to zero. In
Mm,
fact, the odds of that are probably closer to 1%. And, that's going to happen. I think a 1% chance of the end of the planet, is something that should be taken into account. I mean, the damage is so extreme, right? I mean, it's like you talk about mass shooters, you talk about, all of these extreme events. The damage is so extreme that even though the percentage likelihood in any given year is small, this should be a very high priority, right? The damage of a meteor impact on the planet that destroys life. Yeah, it's very unlikely in any given year, but the consequences are catastrophic, right? You
yeah.
should be taking steps to prevent it.
That's
And
right.
I
We have
think
we
that
have
the
oil riggers fully trained to go up into space at the drop of a hat. No, you're right. I
we
think,
should though.
yeah, yeah. I think one of the things that I think about, and we've got our mid-season review in the next episode, and I'm going to
Yeah.
save a couple of thoughts for that about how this film, but also just this whole post-apocalyptic kind of thing has changed my mindset. When you binge these kind of films in short succession, like I think there's a it makes me think. But one of the things is I watched like the film,
We've damaged ourselves here
yeah, a little bit.
for the listening audience.
And we still haven't got to Threads yet, so I've got to do the UK version of this on Patreon. Um, I watched the Chernobyl HBO series, from a couple of years ago. I watched it relatively recently, and one of the things that sort of you mentioned earlier on was this idea of should you be taken out in the blast or should you survive? And I'm very much in this sort of mentality. You sort of watch the thing, it's like you can see we could sit here in the UK and say that Russia has dropped a nuclear weapon on the Ukraine, right, or a part of Ukraine, or I don't know, wherever. And you go, well, that's hundreds of miles away. That's not a problem. That's over 1,000 miles away or whatever. As you say, it's not. Those people that get killed in that blast are dead. They're done for. That's fine. But what happens with all that radiation is it's blasted into the sky and into the atmosphere. Like, which way are the weather channels going? Like, what happens with the rate with the water that's in the atmosphere and all sort of stuff. Like, the knock-on effects of that event can affect, as you say, everybody, and or the radius of impact of the fallout after is much, much larger. And that's where I start to worry. You go, okay, well, it's not what, happens today, tomorrow, or whatever, the day after. Okay, well, the increases of, severe cancer increase in the next 12 months because it's all in the atmosphere, it's in the rain. Yeah, we're all going to, it's the long term or even the medium term effects of something like that are actually catastrophic and painful and terrifying. And that's what kind of starts to worry me. So, yeah, nightmares. That's where we're going with this. But it is, it's just a realization that, and I do think as a species, you say it's going to be the end of the world. It wouldn't. It'll be the end of us. Because the globe will just keep going. The world is indifferent to our presence for the most part.
Well, it's a decimation of the food chain.
Well,
You
yes,
know, I
but the
mean,
globe,
it's not
but
only us, it's plant life and animal life. I mean,
yeah,
microscopic life will probably survive, but I mean,
well, that's it. But yeah, but it can evolve, it can regrow, and I think something may go on, but we wouldn't be here. But I think about this with technology, and I'll end on this really. But I thought about it recently that I think we've got AI and also the stuff, and we say like, oh no, we can. You watch all these sci-fi films, and we've watched an awful lot of them where they're like, we're off into space, and we've got this incredible technology. And I think really the last sort of half decade has shown me, or even the last decade really, it's kind of highlighted to me that we've reached our technological, like there's a balance between technology and intelligence as a species. And we've kind of reached the sort of like technology to intelligence ratio where I'm like, yeah, you've got enough toys now. The idiocy quotation, it seems to be going up, and we've also got access to big red buttons that can do this kind of damage. I don't think we should, you know, I'm not trying to be a luddite. I don't want to stop things, but like, I don't know. It
well,
just
I'm
makes me
not a
wonder.
Luddite. I mean, I love technology. I hate humans. Okay,
Yeah,
I mean, and that's
bring
not
on
true.
Skynet.
That's true. I mean, we talk about like people worry about the AI takeover and whether that AI will trigger a nuclear event,
Mhm.
right? And that's a possibility, but it's also possible that it's what saves us.
Yeah.
Because what I worry about are chimpanzees' brains with nuclear buttons,
Mm.
right? I mean, and you talk about the global situation. All you need is some petty fucking dictator, right? Who's like, yeah, I'm going out. Do I want? And I'm in a tumultuous political
A vengeful
situation.
mood. Yeah.
Yeah. Do I want to order a nuclear attack? Right? I mean, the world's survival should not depend on the whims of a chimpanzee.
Nope.
We are not set up to make rational decisions, uh, you know, in the first place, but we're certainly not set up to make rational decisions about the survival of our species and all the other species. And so, yeah, the AI, an alien takeover, I am on their side. I, and what boggles my mind is the inability of humans to plan for those unlikely events, but also the inability of humans to set up adequate safeguards. Whether
Mm.
you're talking about the threat of, a dictator trying to use executive power in ways that it's not intended, and what are the safeguards? Set up the safeguards, set up the tripwires, um, make sure that a nuclear response is unthinkable and requires as many safeguards as possible to prevent this kind of tragedy.
Yeah.
And I just don't think that we think systemically like that, right? I mean, even in the case of tragedies of humans, right? We say, oh, this is terrible, this kid doesn't have any food. Whoa, let's set up a GoFundMe. It's a happy story on the news. That's not a fucking happy story. I'm
Yeah.
glad that kid is going to survive, but you've done nothing to fix the system that
That
had
led
kids
to that.
starving. Right? Right? Like, that's not a happy story. In fact, you get to feel good about it. But it's like I'm glad Trump's not there anymore, but it's not a happy story. What happens when the next guy gets in and sees what he should have done on day one?
Yeah.
The safeguards are not in place, brother. So I worry about this. This is shit that keeps me up at night. It's
Yeah.
humanity's inability to plan long term and think rationally and set up appropriate safeguards for these catastrophic events.
And I think, yeah, I agree. I feel very much the same. And I think this film. This film gets spoken about. I'd heard about it before we sort of brought it, to do for this season, but I'd never watched it. And this was shown in schools. I found out that this was shown in some schools. And I think Threads, which we talk about on the Patreon, we will talk about on the Patreon, was a similar thing for British students. And I've Googled it, and there were kids that were sort of older than me that were seeing it in 84. It was made in schools when it was sort of brought out. They were like, "Yeah, no, it gave me nightmares." But that was the thing. And it makes me wonder if, I'm not saying we to traumatize our kids, but maybe there is an element of going, I know this film's 40 years old, but it's a historical log of how people felt in the mid 80s, but also kind of worth thinking about because I don't need to sort of take these things for granted anymore. I think we do take things for granted. I mean, that scene with the EMP,
Mm-hmm.
the things it takes out, like cars go out, radio goes out, motorbike goes out, TV, about it, right? Some hospital equipment, yeah. Play that out now.
Uh-huh.
Internet goes out, laptops go out, pacemakers go out,
Mm-hmm. Planes
phones
fall
go
from the
out,
sky.
planes fall from the
Got a lot
sky.
more of them today.
Yeah, cars, just stop. All kinds of things just come to a grinding halt. Street lamps gone.
Your air conditioners, a lot of people can't live without air conditioners.
Yeah, there's a lot of people on home care with medical units now. Gone.
And the thing is, a solar flare is going to do this. At some point, we know this too,
Yeah.
right? Like just like COVID, right? We know that's coming, right? We're not our electrical grid's barely propped. It's propped up with gum.
Yeah.
Like we can't even maintain it, let alone prepare for
I
when this
think
happens, and
I
it's
th
going to happen.
I think we have to be careful here, Julian, because I do think we're talking ourselves into becoming disaster preppers
We're
and
going to be preppers any day
yeah,
now. That's
tin.
that's the end of this podcast.
Yeah.
Is like, well, we did the apocalypse season, and we got a cabin somewhere.
Yeah. We're now going to turn this into a preppers podcast as I build my nuclear shelter in the garden, fill it full of canned goods and purifiers.
It's going to be like GI Joe cartoon, where like
Yeah.
at the end it's like knowing is half the battle. We've got does that prepper messages.
Yes. So yeah, it's interesting. Anyway, we shall end on that delightful note. This is an interesting film. It's a fascinating film, and it's a very well done film.
A stunningly powerful film, and I think it shows how you can make every mistake in the book, in terms of performances and everything else. There are lines that are a little clunky.
Yeah.
I mean, you can have no budget, but Meyer knows how to tug the heartstrings and how to structure something, and this is a masterclass
Mhm.
in how to make a movie under those kinds of restrictions. And technically, there are a lot of ways this doesn't hold up. I'm sure there are some young people who would watch this and say it's hard to get through, because of that. Because the special effects aren't, like they're cozy little superhero movies,
Mhm.
Uh, but it is astounding how effective this movie is.
Yeah.
And I don't totally understand how and why, but it knows the emotional through line of every scene.
I do wonder if that. I'm going to finish on this note because I agree. Everything you've just said, 100%. I think this is effective, and it's just parts of me like I don't understand why it's effective when I watch it. Because I could sit and I could have ripped this to pieces, as I've done with many other films, where I'm like, the acting is bunkum, some of the dialogue is really sort of rote and clunky and da da da. But that's not the point of this film. And, we've talked about things being like a mood piece. There's been other films that have been like a mood piece, like it gives you an atmosphere or a sense. This film kind of works in a similar way, but it's kind of like a Doom piece, where it's just like, here's the characters. You're used to them in almost like a soap opera kind of fashion, and then I'm going to decimate them, and it's just very, very effectively done. I also think, despite their special effects, as you said, um, the missiles going up sometimes, or some of the sort of the stock footage, or some of the other bits and pieces, it's balanced out by the impact of some of the makeup effects that I think are just simple but very, very effective. And also some of the leading performances, and especially in the second half, are just so impactful that it kind of makes up for it. Um, so yeah, no, it's incredibly well done. And I think I'll be interested to see how it stacks up against, or Threads, I should say, stacks up against this, because it's Threads was done a year later and is the UK version of this in many ways. But I can see why Ronald Reagan watched this and was like, "Oh, bugger! Like, this is going to make him think about it." He wanted to stop this from going out at one point. There was a notion of like, should the American people see this? And it was fought for, which is what sort of drove that the day before sort of campaign to make sure it was broadcast. So anyway, I would say this is a fantastic film. Highly recommend it. Just viewing it from that point of view. I do wonder sometimes if it's because you and I went through this to an extent, like we were kids. I was a bit younger than yourself, but like there was still that sense in the 80s of this going on. We shall see. Watch it and find out. People, let us know what you think. Have you watched Threads? Have you watched it? How did this affect your childhood, or when you watched it? What was the feedback, and did it keep you up at night? But we're not done there. Well, we are. This is kind of mid-season. The next episode is a mid-season review. We're going to stop, take a breath of radiated air, and take a look back at what we've done so far. The full Mad Max run, On the Beach, The Last Man on Earth, The Omega Man, Silent Running, A Boy in His Dog, and The Day After. And then following that is an interplanetary interlude of our apocalypse theory. We are going to be doing Alien, Aliens, Alien 3, Alien Resurrection, and leading up to Alien Romulus. It's a bit of a special. We thought it's the right time to do it. Why not? We've both been discussing doing the Alien series at some point, and this feels like a good time to do it before we go on to do the rest of our Apocalypse series. But don't forget, the Apocalypse series will continue on the Patreon. And we are doing all kinds of things on there. We've done I Am Legend, the Quatermass Conclusion, the Last Battle, the World of Flesh and the Devil, and of course Threads in the first half, and more will come after that. So go check that out. Link down below. £5 a month gets you all those different bits and pieces, as well as many other podcasts and content. So for those that do support us, thank you very much. But for those that don't, get your ass over to Patreon and show us some love. Anyway,
Absolutely.
Julian, thank you very much for
Thank you.
another great conversation.
We'll need that alien break.
Yeah.
I want the sweet hopefulness of Xenomorphs.
Yeah, that's it. I need the sort of I need that claustrophobia of Alien, just so I can feel a bit sort of avoid the wasteland of the nuclear wasteland. But yes, anyway, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your support, and I hope you're enjoying this as much as we are, clearly. But let us know what your thoughts are, and we shall see you on the next episode.